Tonight, we'll take you on another quiet journey through time, into one of history's more brutal chapters, told gently so your mind can rest while the past unfolds. Close your eyes and picture this. A palace made of limestone and lies, where every pillar holds up more than just the ceiling. The air tastes of frankincense and fear, and somewhere in the distance, a man who calls himself a living god is about to make the worst mistake of his divine life. It all began with a cough behind a curtain. Not the kind of cough that announces illness, mind you. No rattling chest or fevered wheeze. This was the sort of cough that sounds too deliberate for sickness and too subtle for conversation. The kind that makes you pause mid-bow and wonder if someone is listening who shouldn't be. That's when you realized Pharaoh Teti was slipping. Not politically, of course. The man still commanded armies and built monuments like he was racing the sun itself. Not publicly either. The people still prostrated themselves when his golden barge floated down the Nile, still whispered prayers to his cartouche carved in temple stones. No, Teti was slipping into something far more dangerous for a man perched on a throne of gold, surrounded by nobles with empty bellies and full grudges. He was slipping into the habit of trusting people. You stood there in his audience chamber that morning, watching him lean forward on his throne with the eager attention of a child hearing his first bedtime story. The messenger before him was recounting grain yields from Memphis, and Teti was nodding along like every word was gospel truth. Behind you, his advisors shifted their weight from sandal to sandal, and you could practically hear their thoughts rattling around like coins in an empty purse. The messenger finished his report with a flourish, bowing so low his forehead nearly kissed the polished floor. Teti smiled and praised the man's diligence. He ordered the messenger be given extra rations and a silver ring. The advisors murmured their approval, but you caught the glances they exchanged, the kind of looks that said everything and nothing at once. That's when it occurred to you. A trusting pharaoh is like a clay pot filled with honey and left in a room full of hungry children. Sooner or later, someone's going to tip it over. You didn't hate him, understand. Hatred requires passion, and passion leaves evidence. No, what you felt for Teti was something far more practical. The same feeling you might have for a rickety bridge you have to cross every day. Gratitude for its service, certainly, but also a growing awareness that it might collapse under you at any moment. And wouldn't it be wise to build another route home? Besides, you rather liked breathing. You enjoyed having power that extended beyond the ability to count grain sacks and argue with tax collectors. You preferred living in houses that didn't leak when the Nile flooded, wearing clothes that didn't smell of river mud and desperation. Simple pleasures, really, the kind that required a steady income and the favour of whoever happened to be wearing the double crown this decade. And Teti, for all his divine pretensions, was making that increasingly difficult. Take his habit of promoting people based on merit rather than family connections. Admirable, perhaps, if you were writing moral instructions for children. Less admirable if you were trying to maintain the delicate network of favours and debts that kept the kingdom from eating itself. Or his tendency to actually read the reports his scribes prepared, rather than simply nodding and signing whatever papyrus was placed before him. Or, and this was the truly dangerous part, his growing fondness for asking follow-up questions. "Tell me," he said to you that very morning, after the grain messenger had departed with his silver ring and extra rations, "what do you make of these reports from the northern provinces? The numbers seem optimistic." You felt something cold settle in your stomach, the way it does when you realize you've been walking on ice that's thinner than it appeared. Because the truth was, those numbers were optimistic. Wonderfully, creatively optimistic. The kind of optimism that transformed modest harvests into miraculous bounties and turned tax collection shortfalls into clerical errors. You smiled, bowed your head with just the right amount of deference and said, "My lord's wisdom sees clearly. Perhaps the local governors are enthusiastic in their reporting." Teti chuckled, a sound like stones rolling down a hillside. "Enthusiastic, yes, I like that. We should send someone to verify these enthusiastic reports, don't you think?" And there it was, the moment when you realized that your comfortable position as a trusted advisor who helped massage inconvenient truths into palatable fiction was about to become significantly less comfortable. "Of course, Divine One," you replied, already calculating how quickly you could arrange for those verification missions to encounter complications. I'll see to it personally." "Excellent," Teti said, settling back into his throne with the satisfied air of a man who believed he was solving problems rather than creating them. "I knew I could count on you, my friend." Friend. The word hung in the air like incense smoke, sweet and choking. That evening you walked through the palace gardens as the sun painted the western hills the colour of dried blood. The lotus flowers floated in their pools like severed heads, and somewhere in the distance a night bird called out in a voice that sounded almost human, almost like someone crying for help. You paused beside the reflection pool where Teti sometimes came to think, staring down at your own face wavering in the dark water. The man looking back at you had intelligent eyes and careful hands, the sort of face that inspired confidence without demanding attention. A perfect face for palace work, really, trustworthy enough to handle sensitive matters, forgettable enough to avoid uncomfortable scrutiny. But as you watched, your reflection began to smile. A slow, thoughtful expression that had nothing to do with humour and everything to do with possibility. You didn't hate Pharaoh Teti, but you did hate the idea of ending your days in some provincial posting, counting grain sacks and pretending to believe the creative mathematics of local tax collectors. You hated the thought of watching from a distance as the kingdom either thrived under his increasingly inconvenient honesty or collapsed under the weight of truths it wasn't ready to bear. Most of all, you hated uncertainty. And Teti, with his questions and his integrity and his dangerous habit of trusting the wrong people, represented uncertainty in its purest form. So you smiled at your reflection, bowed to the man who wasn't there, and started collecting secrets like shiny beads on a string. After all, every pharaoh needed advisors. The trick was making sure you advised the right one. The night bird called out again, and this time you were almost certain it was laughing. Sleep comes easier when you're not worried about tomorrow's grain count, doesn't it? When you're not wondering whether the numbers in your ledgers will still make sense by morning, or whether someone might notice that extra zero you added to the tax receipts from Thebes. The first thing you stole wasn't a dagger. It wasn't even particularly valuable by most standards. Just a list, really. Harmless, dusty, tucked behind some priest's wine jug in a storage room that smelled of cedar oil and forgotten prayers. But oh, what a list it was. You'd been conducting one of those tedious inventories that palace administrators love so much, the kind where you count everything twice and pretend the numbers matter. Room after room of stored grain, cloth, oils, weapons, ceremonial objects that hadn't seen daylight since Teti's grandfather wore the crown. The sort of work that makes your eyes water and your back ache, but also the sort that lets you wander into places where busy people don't usually go. That's how you found yourself in the priest's storage chamber, surrounded by amphorae of sacred oils and rolls of papyrus covered in hieroglyphs that would take a scribe 3 days to decipher. And there, wedged between a jar of natron and what appeared to be the mummified remains of a sacred ibis, was a simple scroll tied with ordinary string. Just a roster of names and grain shipments. Nothing that would make the gods weep or the Nile run backward. But you knew those names. Oh, you knew them very well indeed. There was Teti, whose family had controlled the granaries of Memphis for 3 generations, and who still owed your cousin compensation for a goat that had wandered into his barley field. There was Seneb, the district administrator who'd been passed over for promotion twice and had a wife with expensive tastes in jewellery. And Teti, the treasurer's assistant who'd been quietly skimming copper from the temple offerings to pay for his mother's medical treatments. Hungry people, angry people, desperate people. The kind of people who might be very interested in opportunities for advancement, if those opportunities happened to present themselves. You tucked the scroll into your robes with the casual air of someone collecting routine paperwork. After all, who would miss one dusty list among hundreds? And if anyone did notice, well, clerical errors happened all the time. Scribes were only human, despite what they'd have you believe. Back in your own chambers that night, you spread the scroll across your writing table and lit an extra lamp. The names swam in the flickering light like fish in a shallow pool, and you began to see connections that weren't written in any official record. Teti's grain shipments went to districts controlled by men who'd been questioning Pharaoh's recent policy changes. Seneb's administrative reports covered territories where tax collection had been irregular. Teti had access to financial records that could embarrass half the nobles in the kingdom if they were examined too closely. With a reed pen and some careful alterations, you began to annotate the margins. Nothing dramatic, mind you, just small corrections. A name changed here, a quantity adjusted there. The sort of modifications that might occur naturally when tired scribes were working by lamplight. When you were finished, the list told a different story entirely. It suggested that certain shipments had been redirected to unauthorized recipients, that particular officials had been receiving compensation for services not rendered, that specific individuals might be worth investigating more closely. The next morning, you arranged for a small accident in the records room. Nothing spectacular, just a knocked-over oil lamp that started a modest fire in one corner. The kind of mishap that destroyed exactly the right documents while leaving everything else mysteriously untouched. Terrible tragedy, you told the head scribe as he surveyed the damage. All those irreplaceable records, though I did manage to save this. You produced your annotated list with the air of someone performing a civic duty. Perhaps it might help reconstruct what was lost. The head scribe examined the scroll with the reverence reserved for sacred texts. "Blessing of Thoth," he murmured. "This is exactly what we needed. How fortunate that you happened to be nearby when the fire started." "The gods work in mysterious ways," you agreed solemnly. 3 days later, new assignments were posted throughout the palace. Teti found himself promoted to oversee grain distribution in the northern provinces, far from Memphis and his family's traditional power base. Seneb was transferred to a lucrative position managing tax collection in the Delta, where his previous failures could be forgotten in exchange for future loyalty. Teti was appointed to assist with temple finances, a job that came with official oversight and unofficial opportunities. And you, having demonstrated such remarkable quick thinking during the records room fire, were granted expanded access to the palace archives, for administrative purposes of course, to prevent future such tragedies. Now you could wander the corridors of power with the sort of freedom usually reserved for cats and trusted servants. You had keys to rooms most people didn't know existed, authorization to examine documents that weren't meant for your eyes, and the gratitude of colleagues who believed you'd saved them from bureaucratic disaster. The palace revealed itself to you like a lotus flower opening in the morning sun. Hidden ledgers that recorded the true cost of Teti's building projects. Correspondence with provincial governors that revealed the actual state of the kingdom's finances. Records of payments to informants, bribes to foreign officials, and subsidies to temples that were supposed to be self-sufficient. It was beautiful in its way, the gap between what the kingdom claimed to be and what it actually was, the distance between Pharaoh's public declarations and his private concerns, the careful balancing act that kept Egypt prosperous while keeping everyone involved just honest enough to sleep at night. But balancing acts, as any acrobat will tell you, require constant attention. One moment of inattention, one unexpected shift in weight, and everything comes crashing down. You began to collect these inconsistencies, like a scribe collecting rare papyri, a notation here about inflated crop yields, a memo there about delayed tribute payments, letters discussing the true loyalty of certain provincial governors, reports on the actual readiness of the army versus what was being reported to Pharaoh. Each document was a small weight on the scales of power, and you were learning to read those scales like an augur reading the flight of birds. The most interesting discovery was a series of sealed orders that had never been delivered. Instructions from Teti to various officials, dated months ago but somehow misfiled in the archives. Orders that would have significantly changed the kingdom's policies on taxation, military recruitment, and diplomatic relations with neighbouring kingdoms. Important orders. The kind that might have prevented some of the problems the kingdom was currently facing. The kind that someone might have deliberately misfiled. You held one of these orders up to the lamplight, examining the seal and the papyrus for signs of tampering. Everything appeared authentic. Which meant that somewhere in the palace administration, someone else was playing the same game you were. Someone with access to official communications and a skill to make important documents disappear. That night you lay in your bed, listening to the distant sound of the Nile lapping against the palace docks, and you smiled in the darkness, because you'd just learned something more valuable than all the gold in Pharaoh's treasury. You weren't the only one with secrets, and in a palace full of people with secrets, the person who collected the most secrets was the person who collected the most power. All you needed now was a plan and some plausible deniability. Outside your window, the night wind whispered through the papyrus reeds, and it sounded almost like applause. They say the gods speak to those who listen carefully. What they don't mention is that sometimes the gods have help with their pronunciation. To kill a pharaoh, you don't start with a knife. Knives are for peasants and bandits, for people who lack imagination and proper planning. No. When you're dealing with a man who claims to be the living embodiment of divine will, you start with a prayer. Not your own prayer, naturally, that would be reckless, and you'd survive this long by being anything but reckless. But the high priest's assistant, an earnest young man named Kaimwasit, who'd been educated in the temple schools and still believed that piety was its own reward. Now he was very devout and very suggestible. You'd noticed him during the morning ceremonies, the way he lingered after the other priests had filed out, checking and rechecking the arrangement of offerings on the altar, the way he murmured extra prayers under his breath, as if the gods might not have heard him the first time, the way his eyes would dart nervously toward the sanctuary whenever thunder rumbled in the distance, or when birds flew in unusual formations. A true believer, in other words, the dangerous kind. It started small, as these things always do, a casual conversation in the temple corridor about the unusual number of stillborn calves in the royal herds, a thoughtful observation about how the sacred fire had been burning with an odd colour lately, a gentle suggestion that perhaps the omens had been more complex than usual. "I've been having the strangest dreams," you confided to Kaimwasit one evening as you helped him arrange ceremonial implements in the inner sanctuary. "Dreams of serpents wrapped in royal linen. Do you think they might mean something?" Kaimwasit's hand stilled on the golden unk he'd been polishing. "Serpents in linen," he repeated slowly. That's a very specific image." "Probably nothing," he said with a dismissive wave, "just the mind wandering during sleep. Though I must admit the serpent kept speaking, something about broken promises and forgotten oaths." You could practically see the interpretation taking shape behind his eyes. Serpents were symbols of divine wisdom, but also of hidden knowledge and potential danger. Linen suggested royal connections, ceremonial significance. Broken promises could refer to, well, to any number of things, depending on what you wanted them to refer to. "Did the serpents say anything else?" Kaimwasit asked, his voice carefully neutral in the way that indicated serious internal alarm. "Something about ankhs," you mused, glancing at the golden symbol in his hands. "Broken ankhs, I think, or perhaps they were melting. Dreams are so difficult to remember clearly." Kaimwasit set down the ankh as if it had suddenly become white hot. Broken ankhs were about as ominous as dream symbols got. The ankh being the symbol of life itself, its destruction could only mean... "Have you told anyone else about these dreams?" he asked. "Oh no," you assured him. "I wouldn't want to alarm people unnecessarily. Dreams are just dreams after all, unless..." You let the word hang in the air like incense smoke. "Unless?" "Well, the priests at the Temple of Ptah mentioned that their sacred pool has been unusually turbulent lately, and the keeper of the royal menagerie says the sacred cats have been acting strangely, hiding in dark places, refusing to eat. But I'm sure it's all coincidence." It wasn't coincidence, of course. The temple pool was turbulent because you'd been dropping pebbles into it during your visits. The cats were hiding because you'd been feeding them a harmless herb that made them sleepy and antisocial. But Kaimwasit didn't need to know that. What he needed to know was that the signs were everywhere if you knew how to look for them. Over the following weeks, you fed him a steady diet of omens and portents. A flock of ibises flying in the wrong direction. Unseasonable flooding in a distant province. Reports of strange lights seen over the pyramids at Giza. Each incident was real enough. You'd simply arranged for them to be noticed and reported. The beauty of working with a true believer is that they'll do most of the work for you. Kaimwasit began to see patterns in everything. the way the morning sun caught the temple walls, the arrangement of clouds in the afternoon sky, the behaviour of the sacred scarab beetles in their ceremonial chamber. "The gods are trying to tell us something," he confided to you one evening, his voice tight with worry. "All these signs, all these warnings. But I can't understand what they want." "Perhaps," you suggested carefully, "we should consult the ancient texts, the books of prophecy that are kept in the sealed archives?" Kahemwaset's eyes widened. The sealed archives contained documents so sacred that only the high priest and his most trusted assistants were allowed to examine them. Documents that allegedly contained prophecies dating back to the time of the first dynasties. Documents that you'd been quietly editing during your newly expanded access to the palace records. "Do you think," Kahemwaset began, "I think the gods have given you the wisdom to interpret their will," you said. "And I think they wouldn't have sent these signs if they didn't expect someone to act on them." 2 days later, Kahemwaset brought you a papyrus scroll with trembling hands, one of the ancient prophecies, transcribed in his careful script from documents so old and fragile that they could barely be handled. The prophecy was beautifully ominous. It spoke of a ruler whose trust would be his downfall, of advisors who would lead him into darkness, of a kingdom that would prosper only after its leader learned the price of wisdom. It mentioned serpents and broken ankhs, and the importance of choosing loyalty carefully. It also mentioned, in conveniently vague terms, that those who served the gods faithfully would be protected during the coming trials. "What do you think it means?" Kahemwaset asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "I think," you said slowly, "that the gods are warning us about someone close to the throne, someone whose judgment may have been compromised." You didn't name Pharaoh Teti directly. You didn't need to. Kahemwaset was intelligent enough to connect the dots, and frightened enough to want desperately to believe that serving the god's will would protect him from whatever was coming. The court began to whisper, not loudly, not openly, but in the careful way that people whisper when they're not entirely sure whether the walls have ears. Stories of troubling omens and ancient prophecies, reports of priests having disturbing dreams, suggestions that perhaps the gods were not entirely pleased with recent policy decisions. Even Teti began to look nervous. You caught him glancing toward the temple during morning audiences, his fingers drumming restlessly on the arms of his throne. He asked more questions about the priest's reports, wanted detailed explanations of ceremonial procedures, requested additional consultations with the augurs, just enough doubt to make him lean harder on the people he trusted, the advisors who'd served him faithfully, who'd helped him navigate the complexities of rule, who'd never given him reason to question their loyalty. People like you. "Beam's reports about omens," he said to you one afternoon, his voice carefully casual. "Do you think there's anything to them?" "Divine wisdom is beyond my understanding, my lord," you replied. "But I've always found that the gods reveal their will through the people they trust most. Perhaps the answer lies not in the omens themselves, but in how we choose to respond to them." Teti nodded slowly, as if you'd said something profound rather than beautifully meaningless. "You've always been honest with me," he said. "I appreciate that. In times like these, a ruler needs advisors he can trust completely." "Always, my lord," you said, meeting his eyes with the sort of steady gaze that suggested absolute reliability. "You can count on me." And the beautiful thing was, he believed you, poor man. He looked at you and saw loyalty where there was only patience, honesty where there was only careful planning, friendship where there was only professional interest in maintaining your position until the optimal moment for advancement arrived. He called you friend. You called him target. That night, you stood in your chambers looking out at the stars wheeling overhead in their eternal patterns. Somewhere in the distance, night birds called to each other across the darkness, and their voices sounded almost like laughter. The gods, you reflected, did indeed work in mysterious ways. They just occasionally needed a little assistance with the details. Sabotage, it turns out, tastes like stale bread, and smells like lamp oil that's been burning just a little too long. Not the sort of flavours you'd expect to associate with the downfall of a pharaoh, But then again, the most effective conspiracies rarely announce themselves with trumpets and dramatic proclamations. You'd learn by now that the key to undermining a kingdom wasn't to attack its strengths. Armies could fight back, treasuries could be replenished, enemies could be negotiated with or eliminated. No, the trick was to nibble away at the small things, the everyday necessities that people took for granted until they were gone. Things like bread that rose properly, oil that burned cleanly, water that didn't leave an unpleasant aftertaste. You started with the kitchens, naturally. Not the royal kitchens, those were too well guarded, too carefully monitored. But the service kitchens where food was prepared for the palace staff, the guards, the lesser officials who kept the administration running smoothly. A drop of river silt in the water barrels here, a handful of sand mixed into the flour stores there, nothing that would cause serious harm, just enough to make people slightly uncomfortable, slightly irritable, slightly inclined to wonder if someone wasn't taking proper care of things. The beautiful part was how these small discomforts rippled outward. Guards who'd eaten questionable bread were less alert during their shifts. Scribes working with muddy water made more errors in their calculations. Servants dealing with stomach troubles were slower to respond to requests, more likely to forget important messages. And when people began to complain, you were right there to document their concerns and promise to investigate. Such dedication to your duties, such attention to the welfare of palace staff. Pharaoh Teti himself commended your thoroughness. "I don't know what we'd do without you," he said, one morning as you presented him with a detailed report on the kitchen situation. "Your ability to identify problems before they become serious is remarkable." If only he knew how remarkable. The temple offerings were next. Not the major ceremonies, of course. Those were too visible, too carefully observed. But the daily offerings, the routine rituals that happened dozens of times throughout the kingdom. A delayed shipment of incense here, a miscounted delivery of sacred oil there. Offerings that arrived slightly spoiled, or in quantities that didn't quite match the requisitions. The priests began to mutter among themselves, not openly, not in ways that could be traced back to any individual, but with the sort of collective unease that suggested the gods were not entirely pleased with recent events. And when the gods were displeased, well, that reflected poorly on whoever was responsible for maintaining their favour. "The high priest seems concerned," you mentioned to Teti during one of your regular briefings. "Perhaps we should arrange a special ceremony? Something to demonstrate our continued devotion?" Teti nodded thoughtfully. He'd been doing a lot of thoughtful nodding lately, which was exactly what you'd hoped for. A pharaoh who was constantly thinking was a pharaoh who was constantly worrying, and a pharaoh who was constantly worrying was a pharaoh who was making mistakes. The special ceremony was magnificent, naturally. Gold and incense and sacred chants that echoed through the temple halls like the voices of the gods themselves. But somehow, despite all the careful planning and expensive offerings, things went just slightly wrong. The sacred fire smoked more than usual. One of the ceremonial vessels developed a small crack during the ritual. A sacred cat wandered into the sanctuary at an inauspicious moment and had to be gently removed. Small things. Meaningless things, probably. But when you're dealing with divine favour, probably isn't quite good enough. Meanwhile, you'd begun hosting dinner parties. Nothing elaborate, just intimate gatherings where palace officials could relax and discuss the day's events over good food and wine. The sort of social occasions where information flowed as freely as the refreshments, where alliances were formed and tested, where the careful observer could learn who trusted whom and why. You buttered both literal and metaphorical bread with equal skill. "Have you noticed," you might mention casually while passing a bowl of dates, "how the reports from the northern provinces seem to contradict each other? I'm sure it's just a clerical error, but perhaps someone should look into it." Or, "The temple finances are certainly complex this year. All those additional ceremonies and offerings. I hope the priests are keeping proper records." Or, "I heard the strangest rumour about the royal granaries. Something about mice getting into the stored grain. Probably nothing, but you know how these stories spread." Each comment was designed to plant a small seed of doubt, to encourage the sort of careful scrutiny that revealed more problems than it solved. Because once people started looking closely at the kingdom's operations, they discovered that many things that appeared solid and reliable were actually held together by hope and habit. And hope, as any experienced administrator will tell you, is not a reliable building material. The granaries were particularly vulnerable. Egypt's prosperity depended on its ability to store surplus grain from good harvests, to survive the inevitable bad ones. But storage required constant vigilance, protection from moisture, from pests, from theft, from simple decay. All it took was a few strategic gaps in the storage building's walls, a few convenient holes in the sacks, a few accidental contaminations, and suddenly the kingdom's food security was less secure than it appeared. Not enough to cause famine, of course. That would have been counterproductive. Just enough to require increased imports, expanded storage facilities, additional guards, more complex distribution systems. All of which cost money and created new opportunities for the sort of creative accounting that made kingdoms look prosperous on papyrus while struggling in reality. When Teti asked you to investigate these mounting logistical challenges, you accepted with the grave dedication of a man taking on a sacred trust. "I'll get to the bottom of this," you promised him, "whatever it takes." And you did get to the bottom of it. You identified the problems, documented the failures, recommended solutions, and implemented reforms. You were thorough, efficient, and completely trustworthy. The fact that many of the problems you solved were problems you'd created was simply evidence of your remarkable foresight in anticipating potential difficulties. But the most delicate work involved the food itself, not just the supplies and storage, but the actual meals that reached Pharaoh's table. This required a much more subtle touch, because this was where discovery would mean immediate execution, rather than mere embarrassment. It started with offering to oversee the food testing protocols, a reasonable precaution given the recent problems with kitchen supplies. Someone needed to ensure that everything served to Pharaoh met the highest standards of safety and quality. Someone with an eye for detail and a commitment to protecting the royal household. "I'm honoured by your trust," you told Teti when he accepted your offer. "I'll taste everything myself, if necessary." And sometimes you did. Right there in the royal dining chamber, sampling dishes with the sort of careful attention that demonstrated both loyalty and expertise. Of course, what Teti didn't know was that you'd already tested many of those dishes earlier, in the kitchens, where you'd had the opportunity to make small adjustments to recipes, to suggest different seasonings, to recommend particular wines that would complement the meal. The changes were always improvements, naturally. Better flavour, more interesting combinations, enhanced presentation. If some of those enhancements happened to include ingredients that would accumulate in the body over time, well, that was simply good cooking. Bitter almonds added complexity to desserts. Certain mushrooms provided earthy undertones to meat dishes. Small amounts of mercury from temple medicines could be mixed into wine to add a subtle metallic note that sophisticated palates found intriguing. All perfectly natural ingredients, all used in quantities that were individually harmless, all combined with the sort of culinary expertise that made dining with Pharaoh a memorable experience. The key was patience. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to awkward questions from people who were paid to be suspicious of everything. Better to let time do most of the work while you focused on maintaining your reputation as the most reliable, most dedicated, most trustworthy advisor in the kingdom. When the time came for the final test, when Teti asked you personally to verify the safety of his evening meal, you brought him a cup of wine yourself. A particularly fine vintage, you explained, selected especially for the occasion. You watched him drink it with the satisfied expression of a man who knew he was surrounded by people who cared about his welfare. Then you waited, because pharaohs, as you'd learn, never do anything quickly, not even dying. But they do, eventually, get around to it. He didn't die right away, of course. Pharaohs never do. That would be too convenient, too clean, too much like the bedtime stories they tell children about heroes and villains and endings that arrive exactly when they're supposed to. No, death came for Teti the way it comes for most kings. Slowly, stubbornly, with a great deal of theatrical gasping and entirely too much time for last words. You were standing behind his throne when it started, close enough to catch him if he fell, which was fortunate because falling was exactly what he did. Not dramatically, not with the sort of magnificent collapse that court poets would later immortalize in verse. Just a gradual slumping forward, as if the weight of the double crown had finally become too much for his neck to support. "My lord," you said, reaching out to steady him. Your voice carried exactly the right note of concern, worried but not panicked, attentive but not presumptuous. The sort of tone that suggested a loyal advisor responding to an unexpected but minor difficulty. Teti tried to straighten, his hands gripping the arms of his throne with white-knuckled determination. But his breathing had become laboured, each inhalation sounding like wind through papyrus reeds. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool morning air in the audience chamber. "Something wrong," he managed, the words emerging in short gasps. "Feel strange." "Perhaps you should rest, Divine One," you suggested, still maintaining that supportive grip on his shoulder. "The morning audiences can be postponed. Your health is more important than administrative matters." He looked up at you then, and for a moment his eyes were completely clear, alert, almost suspicious, as if some part of him had finally realized that things had been going wrong for longer than simple bad luck could explain. "You," he whispered. "You were always here. Every problem, every solution, always. Help." Your heart performed an interesting little dance in your chest, but your expression remained perfectly composed. "I serve at your pleasure, my lord, as I always have." Teti opened his mouth to say something else, but what emerged was a cough that sounded like sand grinding between stones. He doubled over, his body convulsing with the effort of trying to expel whatever was blocking his airways. That's when you began calling for help. "Guards!" you shouted, your voice echoing through the audience chamber with exactly the sort of desperate urgency that the situation demanded. "Physicians! Something's wrong with Pharaoh!" The response was immediate and gratifying. Guards came running from their posts, their sandals slapping against the polished stone floor. Servants appeared from doorways you hadn't even noticed, their faces pale with alarm. The court physician arrived at a dead run, his medical kit clutched against his chest like a shield. And through it all, you maintained your position at Teti's side, one hand on his shoulder, your face a mask of loyal concern. "What happened?" the physician demanded as he knelt beside the throne. "He complained of feeling strange," you reported, your voice steady despite the chaos erupting around you. "Difficulty breathing, weakness, it came on suddenly." The physician began his examination, checking Teti's pulse, examining his eyes, pressing his ear to the royal chest to listen to the laboured breathing. His movements were efficient, professional, but you could see the growing confusion in his expression. "The symptoms don't match any known poison," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Pulse is irregular but not weak. Breathing is obstructed, but the airways appear clear. It's almost as if—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice what you both knew he was thinking. "Almost as if something was destroying the pharaoh from the inside, slowly and systematically, in ways that didn't leave obvious traces." "Could it be divine judgment?" you suggested quietly, your voice pitched just loud enough for the guards and servants to hear. "The priests have been reporting troubling omens for weeks." The physician shot you a sharp look, but several of the guards nodded grimly. They'd heard the whispers, seen the signs, witnessed the small failures that had been accumulating throughout the palace. The idea that the gods might finally be expressing their displeasure wasn't entirely unreasonable. Teti made another sound, somewhere between a cough and a gasp, and tried to speak, but the words that emerged were unintelligible, just fragments of sound that might have been names or curses or prayers. His eyes darted around the room, focusing on faces with the desperate intensity of a man trying to communicate something vital before time ran out. His gaze landed on you, and for a moment the confusion cleared. His mouth moved, forming silent syllables that looked suspiciously like an accusation. But you were already moving, already positioning yourself between Teti and the assembled crowd, already interpreting his struggles in ways that served your purposes. "He's trying to tell us something," you announced, leaning closer as if straining to hear his words. "Something about judgment, divine will." It wasn't what Teti was trying to say, of course, but it was what the witnesses would remember hearing, especially after the physicians confirmed that no earthly poison could explain his condition, after the priests declared that the timing aligned perfectly with the recent omens, after the investigation revealed no evidence of human interference. "Get him to his chambers," the physician ordered, away from the crowds. "He needs rest and quiet." Moving Pharaoh required a coordinated effort. Guards cleared the corridors, while servants prepared his bedchamber. You helped support his weight as the small procession made its way through the palace, your grip steady and protective, your expression appropriately grave. But even as you played the role of concerned advisor, you were calculating. Teti was dying, but not quickly enough. There were still hours, possibly days, before the accumulated damage to his organs would finish what you'd started. Hours during which he might recover enough coherence to make dangerous accusations. Days during which skilled physicians might identify the true cause of his condition. Time was not your ally now. In his bedchamber, surrounded by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls, Teti fought for every breath. The physician prepared various remedies, purges to clear his system, stimulants to strengthen his heart, sacred amulets to ward off malevolent influences. None of them would help, of course, but they provided useful theatre for the growing audience of courtiers and officials who'd gathered to witness their pharaoh's struggle. "Is there anything he needs?" you asked the physician, your tone suggesting complete willingness to help however possible. "Water," came the reply. "Small sips to keep his throat clear. And perhaps someone should send for the priests, in case..." The unfinished sentence hung in the air like incense smoke. In case this was the end. In case divine favour had finally been withdrawn. In case 32 years of rule were about to conclude in this lamplit chamber, with its smell of medicines and fear. You personally fetched the water, selecting a cup from Teti's own collection and filling it from the pitcher that had been brought for his personal use. As you lifted it to his lips, your hand was perfectly steady. "Drink slowly, my lord," you murmured, tilting the cup with practiced care. "Small sips." Teti's eyes met yours over the rim of the cup, and in them you saw not confusion now, but clarity. Terrible, complete clarity. He knew. Somehow, despite the fog of his condition, he understood exactly what was happening and who was responsible. But clarity, unfortunately for him, didn't translate into the ability to communicate that knowledge to others. The water helped, briefly, clearing his throat enough for speech, but when he tried to form words, they emerged as harsh whispers that the assembled witnesses couldn't quite understand. "What's he saying?" someone asked. You leaned closer, as if straining to hear, then straightened, with an expression of solemn understanding. "Says the gods. The gods have called him home," you announced quietly. "He accepts their judgment." It wasn't what Teti had said. What he'd actually whispered, in the brief moment when his voice worked, was, "You, murderer, all of you will pay." But that wasn't the sort of final message that would serve anyone's interests, least of all your own. The priests arrived as the sun reached its zenith, filling the chamber with the scent of sacred oils and the sound of ancient chants. They performed the rituals appropriate for a pharaoh's passing, blessing his journey to the afterlife, ensuring that the gods would receive his car with appropriate honor. Through it all, you remained at his bedside, occasionally offering water, sometimes adjusting his pillows, always maintaining the image of loyal devotion that had served you so well for so long. When the end finally came, it was with one last rattling breath that sounded almost like laughter. Teti's eyes fixed on the ceiling, then grew still, and the only sound in the chamber was the soft crackling of oil lamps and the whispered prayers of priests. "The God King has joined his ancestors," the high priest announced solemnly. "His earthly reign is ended, but his divine essence lives on." Round the chamber, people began to weep. Some from genuine grief, others from uncertainty about what would come next, still others from the simple human response to witnessing death. You allowed tears to gather in your own eyes, not difficult, considering the magnitude of what had just occurred. "He was a good pharaoh," you said, your voice thick with apparent emotion. "Egypt has lost a wise ruler." And it was true, in its way. Teti had been competent, relatively honest, genuinely concerned with his kingdom's welfare. Under different circumstances, you might even have continued serving him faithfully. But circumstances, as any experienced courtier will tell you, have a way of changing whether you want them to or not. The guards who came to investigate found no evidence of foul play. The physicians who examined the body discovered nothing that couldn't be explained by natural causes, possibly hastened by divine displeasure. The priests who interpreted the omens confirmed that the timing was consistent with their recent warnings about the need for spiritual purification. Someone suggested that perhaps Teti's trusted advisor should be questioned, given his close proximity to events. But when they looked for you, you were in the temple, weeping before the altar and praying for your departed Pharaoh's soul. Such devotion, such loyalty, such obvious grief. Sleep comes easier when you don't have to worry about betraying anyone's trust, doesn't it? When the weight of loyalty no longer presses down on your chest like a stone sarcophagus, and you can finally breathe freely in the spaces between one heartbeat and the next. Afterwards, the sun still rose, farmers still argued about irrigation rights and the quality of their neighbours' barley, merchants still haggled over the price of copper and the authenticity of imported cedar. The Nile still flooded its banks each year with the reliable punctuality of a well-trained scribe, depositing rich silt across the fields, and renewing the cycle of growth and harvest that had sustained Egypt since the time of the first pharaohs. But things were different now. You were different. The funeral was magnificent, naturally. Gold and incense and mourning ceremonies that lasted for 70 days, while the embalmers did their sacred work. The whole kingdom wept for their departed god-king, or at least performed convincing imitations of weeping. Tributary kingdoms sent condolences along with their annual payments. Neighbouring rulers offered diplomatic sympathies while quietly calculating how Teti's death might affect their own territorial ambitions. Through it all, you played your part perfectly. The grieving advisor, devastated by the loss of a trusted friend and wise ruler. Your tears were genuine enough, not from sorrow certainly, but from the sheer relief of having successfully navigated the most dangerous undertaking of your career. The succession proceeded smoothly. Teti's chosen heir ascended to the throne with appropriate ceremony, surrounded by advisors and officials who pledged their loyalty with enthusiasm that seemed almost sincere. The new pharaoh was young, earnest, and remarkably grateful for the guidance of experienced administrators who'd served his predecessor faithfully. "I don't know how I'll manage without your wisdom," he confided to you during one of his first private audiences. "Father spoke of you often. He said you were the most trustworthy man in the kingdom. Your father was generous in his assessment," you replied with appropriate modesty. "I served him as best I could, and I'll serve you the same way." And you meant it, in your way. You would serve the new pharaoh faithfully, efficiently, and with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized your previous work. The only difference was that now you understood exactly where your ultimate loyalties lay, and they lay with whoever could best ensure your continued prosperity and breathing. The throne was quieter now, somehow, heavier. The weight of absolute power settling into new hands always created a period of adjustment, a time when everyone involved had to relearn their roles and relationships. The new pharaoh asked different questions than his father had, worried about different problems, trusted different people. But some things remained constant. The need for competent administration, the importance of maintaining good relationships with the priests and the provincial governors, the value of having advisors who understood how to solve problems discreetly and efficiently. You didn't take the throne yourself, obviously. That would have been tacky, not to mention dangerously obvious. Besides, being pharaoh was hard work. All those ceremonies and public appearances, all that responsibility for the kingdom's welfare, all those people expecting you to be divinely inspired on a regular basis. Much better to remain in the shadows, offering advice and guidance to whoever happened to be wearing the crown this decade. Let them deal with the grand pronouncements and the burden of divine authority. You preferred the more practical aspects of power, the kind that involved knowing which documents to file and which to lose, which officials to promote and which to quietly transfer to distant provinces, which problems to solve and which to allow to solve themselves. Your recommendations, you discovered, carried considerable weight with the new administration. When you suggested that certain troublesome officials might be happier in other positions, those transfers were approved with remarkable speed. When you identified potential problems in the kingdom's finances or defences, resources were allocated to address them before they became serious. When you recommended policy changes that would strengthen Egypt's position relative to its neighbours, those recommendations were implemented with gratifying efficiency. Your enemies, such as they were, found themselves increasingly isolated, not through any dramatic purges or obvious persecution, but through the simple mechanism of bureaucratic inconvenience. Their requests took longer to process. Their reports were filed in the wrong offices. Their recommendations were somehow overlooked in the rush of more pressing business. Teti continued his work in the northern provinces, efficiently managing grain distribution while remaining blissfully unaware of how his earlier promotion had served purposes beyond administrative efficiency. Seneb thrived in his delta position, his previous failures forgotten in exchange for continued loyalty and careful record-keeping. Teti maintained the temple finances with exemplary precision, grateful for his second chance and determined to prove worthy of the trust placed in him. Such dedicated public servants, such useful witnesses to the kingdom's proper functioning, such convenient alibis for the period when things had gone so mysteriously wrong. Amazing how difficult it became for certain other people to get things done when they lacked proper administrative support. Peace returned to the kingdom, sort of. The troubling omens that had plagued Teti's final months mysteriously ceased. The gods, it seemed, were pleased with the new arrangement. Temple offerings arrived on schedule, granary supplies remained properly stored, and the various minor irritations that had made palace life so stressful began to resolve themselves. You celebrated these improvements with appropriate satisfaction. After all, solving problems was what you did best, whether those problems involved logistics, personnel management, or the occasional need to remove obstacles to the kingdom's continued prosperity. They called it the will of the gods, this return to stability and order. Divine judgment that had removed an inadequate ruler and replaced him with someone more suited to the demands of absolute power. You called it Tuesday. Well, not literally Tuesday. The actual events had unfolded over several months, and the specific day of the week was hardly relevant to the larger patterns of cause and effect. But there was something satisfying about reducing the overthrow of a pharaoh to the level of routine administrative business, the sort of task that required careful planning and attention to detail, but ultimately was no more remarkable than any other aspect of palace management. Some nights, when the wine was particularly good and the oil lamps cast interesting shadows on your chamber walls, you found yourself wondering what might have happened if Teti had been less trusting, if he'd been more suspicious of his advisors, more careful about whom he relied on, more attentive to the small signs that someone in his inner circle was not quite as loyal as they appeared. Would he have discovered your activities in time to prevent them? Would he have found a way to remove you without creating the very instability you'd been working to exploit? Would he have surprised you with unexpected cunning, turning your own methods against you in some elaborate counter-conspiracy? The questions were interesting in an abstract way, like wondering what would happen if the Nile suddenly flowed backward, or if the sun decided to rise in the west. Hypothetical scenarios that had no bearing on the world as it actually existed, but provided amusing intellectual exercise during quiet evenings. Because the truth was simpler and more practical than any dramatic alternative. Teti had trusted you because you'd given him excellent reasons to trust you. You'd served him faithfully, efficiently, and with apparent dedication for years before circumstances made it necessary to reconsider that arrangement. Even in his final moments, he'd found it difficult to believe that someone who'd been so consistently helpful could also be so thoroughly treacherous. That was the real key to successful conspiracy, you'd learned. Not dramatic betrayals or sudden revelations of hidden enmity, but the patient cultivation of relationships that served everyone's interests right up until the moment when they didn't. Sometimes, just before sleep claimed you, you would imagine conversations with Teti's spirit. Explanations of why his death had been necessary, justifications for the methods you'd employed, discussions of the political realities that had made your choice inevitable. In these imaginary conversations, his car was remarkably understanding. Almost grateful, really, for the clean efficiency with which you'd managed his transition from life to the afterlife. No messy civil wars, no foreign invasions taking advantage of succession disputes, no collapse of the administrative systems he'd worked so hard to establish. Just a smooth transfer of power from one capable ruler to another, facilitated by an advisor who understood the importance of stability and continuity in government. You did what was necessary, his spirit would tell you in these dreams. I might not approve of your methods, but I can't argue with your results. Then you would laugh, because of course Teti's spirit would say exactly what you wanted it to say. That was the beauty of imaginary conversations. They always ended with everyone agreeing that you'd made the right choice for the right reasons. The real Teti you suspected would have had some rather pointed observations about your definition of loyalty and your approach to problem solving. But the real Teti was beyond such concerns now, safely entombed with all the golden trinkets and sacred texts he'd need for his journey through the underworld. And you were left with the practical business of helping to run a kingdom, serving a new pharaoh who appreciated your experience and expertise, managing the sort of everyday administrative challenges that kept Egypt prosperous and stable. It was, you reflected, a perfectly satisfactory arrangement. The Nile continued to flow toward the sea, carrying with it the silt that would fertilize next year's crops, and the prayers of farmers who trusted that the gods would continue to bless their labors. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, marking the passage of seasons and the turning of years. And somewhere in the palace archives, carefully filed among thousands of other administrative documents, was a complete record of your service to Pharaoh Teti. Every report you'd written, every recommendation you'd made, every problem you'd solved. Future historians, if they were very diligent and very lucky, might eventually piece together enough fragments to understand what had really happened during those final months of Teti's reign. They might even figure out your role in events, though proving it would be considerably more difficult. But that was a problem for future historians to worry about. You had more immediate concerns: a new pharaoh to serve, a kingdom to help administer, a position of trust and authority to maintain through the careful application of competence and loyalty. After all, someone had to keep the water flowing and the bread rising and the oil burning cleanly. Someone had to make sure the gods remained satisfied with their offerings, and the people remained confident in their ruler's divine authority. Someone had to ensure that Egypt continued to prosper, whatever the personal cost to individuals who happened to get in the way of progress. It was important work, sacred work really. Historical clarification. Now, for those of you who insist on spoiling a perfectly good bedtime story with tedious concerns about historical accuracy and what actually happened, here's your dose of reality. Because apparently some people can't simply enjoy a tale of ancient treachery without demanding footnotes. The historical Pharaoh Teti did indeed rule Egypt during the 6th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, approximately 2nd Re, 452-323 BCE. His reign marked a period of relative stability, following the political upheavals that had characterized the end of the 5th dynasty. Teti inherited a kingdom that was dealing with the challenges of maintaining centralized control over Egypt's increasingly powerful provincial governors, managing complex trade relationships with neighboring kingdoms, and keeping the massive bureaucracy that made Egyptian civilization possible running smoothly. According to the surviving historical records, which, admittedly, are about as reliable as a papyrus boat in a thunderstorm, Teti was assassinated by his palace guards. The ancient historian Manetho, writing much later, recorded that Teti was slain by his own guards, though he provided no details about the motives or methods involved. This laconic entry in the historical record leaves considerable room for speculation about exactly how and why Egypt's pharaoh met his end at the hands of the very people sworn to protect him. What we do know is that Teti's death marked the beginning of a period of political instability that would eventually contribute to the collapse of the Old Kingdom. His successor, Userkare, ruled for only a few years before being replaced by Teti's son, Pepi, suggesting that the succession was neither smooth nor uncontested. The fact that palace guards were involved in the assassination indicates that the conspiracy reached deep into the royal household's inner circle, involving people with intimate access to the pharaoh's daily routines and personal security arrangements. The political context of Teti's reign provides several plausible motives for such a conspiracy. The 6th dynasty pharaohs faced increasing challenges from provincial governors who were accumulating wealth and power at the expense of central authority. These governors controlled local resources, commanded regional military forces, and were developing hereditary claims to their positions that threatened the pharaoh's ability to maintain unified control over the kingdom. A pharaoh who attempted to reassert central authority might well have faced resistance from nobles who preferred the existing arrangement. Economic pressures also played a role in the period's instability. The massive building projects of earlier dynasties had strained Egypt's resources, while climate change was beginning to affect the reliability of the Nile's annual floods. Lower flood levels meant reduced agricultural productivity, which translated into decreased tax revenues and increased competition for scarce resources. In such circumstances, palace officials might well have concluded that a change in leadership was necessary to address the kingdom's mounting challenges. The religious dimension of pharaonic rule added another layer of complexity to any potential conspiracy. Pharaohs were considered living gods, divine intermediaries between the human and supernatural worlds. Assassinating a pharaoh wasn't just regicide, it was deicide, an act that required extraordinary justification. Any successful conspiracy would have needed to convince participants that the gods themselves had withdrawn their favour from the current ruler, making his removal not just politically expedient, but religiously necessary. Our fictional narrative explores how such a conspiracy might have unfolded, drawing on what we know about Egyptian palace administration, religious practices, and political culture. The character of our narrator, a trusted advisor who manipulates administrative systems, religious interpretations, and personal relationships to achieve his goals, represents the kind of individual who would have had both the access and the expertise necessary to orchestrate such a complex undertaking. The methods described in our story reflect real aspects of ancient Egyptian governance and palace life. The kingdom's prosperity did depend on complex systems for storing and distributing grain, managing temple offerings, and maintaining administrative records. Palace officials did have significant influence over these systems, and someone with the right access and expertise could indeed have used their position to create the kind of systematic problems that might justify drastic action. The religious manipulation depicted in our narrative also reflects historical realities about how ancient Egyptians understood divine will and royal legitimacy. Omens, dreams, and prophecies played important roles in political decision-making, and religious officials had significant influence over how such signs were interpreted. A conspiracy that successfully convinced key religious figures that the gods were displeased with the current pharaoh would have gained powerful allies and important legitimacy. What our story cannot tell us, of course, is exactly what happened in the palace corridors and administrative chambers where Teti's fate was decided. The historical record preserves only the outcome, a dead pharaoh and a period of political instability that followed. The specific details of how palace guards came to turn against their divine master, what promises or threats motivated their actions, and who ultimately benefited from Teti's death remain matters for speculation. What we can say with confidence is that Teti's assassination represents a crucial moment in ancient Egyptian history, marking the beginning of the end for the Old Kingdom's centralized authority. Within a few generations, the unified state that had built the Great Pyramids and established Egyptian civilization's foundational institutions would fragment into competing regional powers, ushering in the chaotic period known as the First Intermediate Period. So sleep well, knowing that even in ancient Egypt, trusted advisors with administrative access and flexible morals could topple kingdoms with nothing more than careful planning and attention to detail. Some things, it seems, never change. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us on this journey through ancient Egyptian palace intrigue. We hope your dreams are filled with properly organized conspiracies and administratively sound regicide. Sweet dreams, and remember, always read the fine print on your grain shipment records.